We are back again with On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here once again at the Apex in Vegas for UFC 258. You know, I am very thankful that we are getting fights during a global pandemic, but last week was just further proof that literally anything can happen to these fight cards. Almost half of the originally booked fights for UFC Vegas 18 last week got cancelled, which left the UFC having to find numerous late notice replacements. But onto this event, the main event here is a massively anticipated fight as Kamaru Usman looks to defend his welterweight championship against his former long-time training partner, Gilbert Burns. There's no beef here in this fight, it's simply just two training partners that have reached the top of the sport in the same division and have to fight. But that's what makes this fight amazing, because I personally believe that both fighters and all of their mutual long-time training partners have a very good idea of exactly how this fight plays out. And for me, that's so exciting. I cannot wait for this fight to go down and to find out if it's and still or and new. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMAPlay365. We are coming off a fantastic event last week. We had a max bet on Alexander Volkov at -175, which beat the closing betting line, and the fight played out exactly how I analysed it too. The free dog of the week was Beneil Dariush. He came through for us, and the Fun Gamblers had one parlay win along with 70% of the parlay pieces winning too. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice that you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too. So to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event for the UFC Welterweight Championship. We've got Kamaru Usman versus Gilbert Burns. Usman is currently the -280 favourite. The comeback on Burns at +240 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the betting line's quite accurate if I'm honest, so I don't think that there's too much value. If you are forcing me to choose a value side, then I would probably edge towards the dog in Gilbert Burns, but like I say, I think the line's fair, I think it's accurate. As for where the betting line moves, I do think that we're going to see some fluctuation throughout fight week. At the minute, the current trend is the money on Kamaru Usman. I do think that -280 might turn into -300, but I think at some point it's going to hit a brick wall around that -300 mark, and people will simply just start to back the underdog because the line has gone too far. As for how this fight plays out though, like I said in the introduction to this podcast, I'm so excited for this fight, and I believe that both fighters do have a good idea of how this fight's going to play out. They were training together for years, long-time training partners, so they're going to understand what positions and what areas of mixed martial arts that they were getting the better of their opponent and the training partner at the time in those training sessions over the years. And I also believe that's going to play a mental factor as well, so that's definitely something to look out for. The one thing that I will say in regards to this though, just something to keep in mind and keep caution, it is actually very common in mixed martial arts for fighters to underperform in the gym but then look like a beast inside the cage, and also vice versa. So if Usman or Burns fits into either of those categories, then the narrative of what happened in training during those training sessions just becomes a little less relevant. So just something to keep in mind. But how these fighters match up stylistically is really interesting, because the development of the striking of Gilbert Burns is something that has to be talked about here, because it's key to this fight. His striking from a technical standpoint has improved dramatically over the years. Obviously, he's a legit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. We know this. That's where his base is in mixed martial arts, and that's what has got him through the majority of his UFC wins. But recently his striking is looking much more improved. It's looking crisp, his movement's good, his speed's there, he looks like he's at the right weight division as well. And particularly in regards to his movement, that's going to be key in this fight, because he's got to keep distance in my opinion. Even though his jiu-jitsu is world class, it is one of the best in the UFC, I do believe that the wrestling and the heavy top pressure of Usman will nullify that jiu-jitsu. So sure, Gilbert Burns will be trying to lock in arm bars or triangles or trying to sweep or reverse Usman if he is taken down, but I just don't think that he's going to get away with submitting Usman off his back or reversing or sweeping Usman either. Usman's just really safe, really heavy, and his ground and pound is enough to keep the fight active enough for the referee not to separate them or stand them back up. So for me, the way Gilbert Burns wins this fight is to keep the fight on the feet, keep his distance, pop away at Usman, land more volume, even if it's on the back foot, put some power into his strikes, potentially try and knock Usman out, or just keep that volume active throughout 5 rounds and try and win a decision. But the second that Usman starts closing the distance, tying up with Burns, I think Usman is definitely the more physical fighter. I think he's going to be the stronger fighter visibly. I don't see him having any problems pushing Burns as back against the cage. I think that his cardio will hold out as well. We know that Usman is an athletic freak, so I don't see that being an issue. And then if he can't score the takedowns against Burns, or if he is worried about putting Burns on his back, then he can just use his strength and his physicality just to keep Burns pressed against the cage and land strikes in the clinch, in close quarters, dirty boxing. And as I've already mentioned, just do enough inside that clinch for the referee not to separate them or separate them often. We saw Usman adopt that exact game plan against Tyron Woodley when he won the welterweight championship. Now, Usman wasn't concerned with Woodley's submission game off his back, but Usman was just comfortable pinning Woodley against the cage, and I think he threw over 400 strikes on Woodley whilst Woodley was inside the cage. Those short strikes, like I've just mentioned, in close quarters, the dirty boxing, and I think that would be the safest game plan for Usman here. But I do also believe genuinely that Usman will be fine if he does take Burns down. Usman's top game is so heavy, as I've already mentioned, and I will actually be quite shocked if Burns was to catch a submission off his back as well. So ultimately, due to the wrestling and to the clinch game of Kamaru Usman, I think he's got 2 solid paths to victory there, paths to beat Gilbert Burns. He's just got to be able to close the distance, and in this small cage inside the Apex, I think that cage size absolutely favours somebody like Usman. It means that Burns' movement is going to be more limited. He's not going to be able to move as erratically, and the distance management is just ultimately going to be much harder. I do think that Kamaru Usman is going to be able to close that distance quite easily. I think he's going to be able to tie up with Burns. From there, he's got a choice: either hold Burns against the cage or try and take him down. I think either of those scenarios favours Usman. His strength, his wrestling, his physicality, I think is going to nullify the improved striking of Burns. I think it's going to nullify the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu of Gilbert Burns. I think we hear, and still, I'm picking Kamaru Usman to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the returning Maycee Barber versus Alexa Grasso. Alexa Grasso is currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Barber at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, there is minimal value on Alexa Grasso in my opinion, but I do think, again, like I've just said with the main event, that the betting line is quite fair, it's quite accurate. So if you are going to push me for value, I would say the value sits with Grasso very minimally right now. As for where the betting line moves, the current trend, and the trend since these lines were released, has been the money on Grasso, opposed to Maycee Barber, who was the hype train in the UFC in the women's flyweight division. But like I say, that trend's been with money coming in on Alexa Grasso. I do agree with it, but I think that at some point it's going to hit that brick wall, maybe -150, -155, and then Barber money will come back in. I think the betting line is going to close on Saturday night, roughly where we're sitting right about now, but I could see Alexa Grasso being -140, -135 with Maycee Barber around +115. As for how this fight plays out though, firstly, I think the move up to the flyweight division for Alexa Grasso from strawweight has definitely been a good move for her. She did struggle with the weight cut. She made that move up, and actually the flyweight debut against Ji-Yeon Kim, she was really, really good. It was a bit of a slow start from Grasso. I do think that Kim was doing well in the early stages of that fight, but the longer the fight played out, the more Grasso grew into it. I think that she got her timing down really well, her reads in really well. She had a boxing on point. She was using more kicks as well, low kicks, body kicks, head kicks, so I was really impressed with that flyweight debut for Grasso. I do definitely think that that's her optimal weight class and the weight class where we'll see her do her best work for sure. Now with Maycee Barber, she only fought once last year, which is fine. It was a difficult year for a lot of people, fighters and the world, but that fight was in January of last year, so the start of last year. It was a freak loss to Roxanne Modafferi, a fight where I think she would win 9 times out of 10, but unfortunately that injury to her knee did play a huge role in her losing that fight, and that's why she's taken the time off. She's had surgery, she's healed up, and now she's back. In regards to how these two fighters match up stylistically though, I do have problems with Maycee Barber's striking defensively. Offensively, when she's moving forward, she's great, she's aggressive, she's powerful, she'll throw big hooks, big combinations with her hands, and she does damage her opponents badly. She does finish her opponents, which is something that's great to see in the women's flyweight division. But the one problem that I have is defensively, and this is where she's going to have problems against Grasso if she doesn't fix these problems, is she's very hittable, especially off kicks. I noticed it fight after fight. The JJ Aldrich fight, she was getting tagged up a lot from kicks. She doesn't move her head off the center line, and that's where Alexa Grasso really shines from her style. She is a boxer, she's got good, quick, straight strikes down the middle, and if Grasso can really put herself on the front foot here, get Barber moving backwards, I think she'll absolutely piece her up on the feet. She will have to be careful of Barber landing a big hook or a big elbow, something that hurts her and then gets her moving backwards. But ultimately with this fight, I think whilst it's striking, I do definitely favour Alexa Grasso. I think Barber's just too hittable, and I think the difference in the striking is very apparent here. However, where I see Barber doing well in this fight is if things are getting a little bit tough on the feet, which I think they're going to be, then all she'll need to do is stop moving backwards for a second, move forwards, tie up with Grasso, push her back against the cage. And this is where Barber's going to have some success in this fight, because I do think that Barber is definitely the stronger fighter, the more physical fighter. And in the clinch, against the cage, in those close quarters, I do think Barber will be a nightmare for Grasso. I think she'll land nasty elbows. I think she could potentially hurt Grasso against the cage as well. So it's imperative for Grasso to stay out of those positions, get an underhook, try and turn Barber and just escape, disengage. But I don't think it's going to be that simple. So we've really got an interesting fight in regards to the stand-up, because out at distance I think Grasso is the far superior striker, but I think in close quarters inside that clinch range, I think Barber will prove to be a big problem for Grasso. In regards to the ground game of both women, I do think it's quite simple. I think they've both got really good skills in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I don't think they're the best wrestlers, but the trip takedowns seem to be able to work. But ultimately, any success in the grappling realm in this fight will come from the fighter that's on top. I think that if Grasso's on top of Barber, then Barber will have problems trying to stand back up or trying to sweep or reverse, and vice versa. If Barber gets on top of Grasso, I think that Grasso will have problems as well. I don't think this fight's going to be won and lost on the mat, though. I do think we might see some grappling exchanges, but I think the greater work is going to be done on the feet, in the striking department. And I feel that with Grasso being the better striker at distance, I think she might land more volume. But on the flip side, I think that Barber is going to be the more aggressive fighter in regards to looking like a fighter's trying to finish the fight. So it could be one of those fights where we get to a decision and the judges have got a choice between volume or the fighter that is being trying to put the lights out of the opponent. Ultimately, I do think that Maycee Barber is more hittable. I do think the volume will be greater than the aggressiveness and the power that Barber brings to the cage. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick Alexa Grasso to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Kelvin Gastelum versus Ian Heinisch. Gastelum is currently the -210 favourite. The comeback on Heinisch at +175 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Gastelum at -210. Even though he's on a 3-fight losing streak, I do think he's fought the better competition, and I do believe it's a little bit of a step down in competition here with Heinisch, and rightly so. Like I said, 3-fight losing streak, you're going to take that step down. But yeah, I think the value's with Gastelum in this fight. As for where the betting line moves, the current trend is the move on Ian Heinisch, and part of me doesn't actually hate that. I can understand it. If Kelvin Gastelum is declining, I know he's only 29, but miles on the clock, the war with Adesanya, if he is declining, then that plus money number on Ian Heinisch does look good. That might be on people's mind. But I do think it's only going to go so far before money comes back in on Gastelum. Ultimately, when these two step in the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, like I've already mentioned, it is a step down in competition for Gastelum, and as I've already mentioned as well, rightly so, and it's going to be a really good fight. Both fighters are really well-rounded, they can both strike, they can both wrestle, they've both got good jiu-jitsu, so it's going to be a good fight. I think we're going to see a lot of elements of mixed martial arts. I think we're going to see some nice striking, we're going to see takedowns, I think we're going to see some grappling. Ultimately though, I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet, and they've both got similar volume in regards to how much they output on the feet, and the striking defense is also quite similar as well. But the one thing that you've got to consider with that is that's all similar based on their level of competition that they've been fighting. So that's similar with Gastelum fighting the cream of the crop, the Israel Adesanyas, Darren Tills, and I do think that Gastelum is still a top 5 to 10 fighter for sure. I'm not sure if he's improving from fight to fight. We might have seen a finished product from Gastelum, but I definitely think that he's still up there, even though he is on a 3-fight losing streak. I do put Gastelum in that mix of fighters like Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier, Darren Till, Paulo Costa. Whereas with Ian Heinisch, those output numbers and the defensive striking that I spoke about, those have come with lower level competition compared to the competition that Gastelum's been fighting. So fighters like Gerald Meerschaert, Omari Akhmedov, Antonio Carlos Jr., Derek Brunson to an extent, although I think that Derek Brunson is definitely the best fighter that Ian Heinisch has fought, and that fight's actually really interesting because that was a step up in competition for Ian Heinisch. It was also a step down in competition for Derek Brunson, very similar to how this fight is, and Derek Brunson definitely looked like the veteran inside the cage. He did have moments early on in that first round where he got dropped, but he got back up and he cruised to a decision victory, but ultimately you could just see that level and that experience of Derek Brunson paid off in that fight, and I think we're going to see very similar things here. I think that this fight is going to be very competitive, especially early on, but I think the longer the fight goes on, I think Ian Heinisch will tire like he did in the Brunson fight. We have seen it in numerous fights before as well. The reason it never looks too drastic is because he normally drags his opponent's gas tank down worse than what his is, so even though he's tired, he looks like the fresher fighter, but I think Gastelum's gas tank will hold up more. I think the longer the fight goes on, the more Gastelum will look to pull away in this fight. Like I say, I think it's going to be close early on, potentially early in the second round as well, but I think Gastelum is just a level above Ian Heinisch, and I think that'll show on the night, so I'm picking Kelvin Gastelum to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Pedro Munhoz versus Jimmie Rivera. This fight should have gone down in January, and I'm glad it was rescheduled because I do think it's a really good fight. Jimmie Rivera is currently the -145 favourite. The comeback on Munhoz at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Jimmie Rivera marginally at -145. I do agree with the betting line. I think it is justified, especially when you look at the form of both fighters. So yeah, I do think that Jimmie Rivera is the value side out of the two. And as for where this betting line moves, I do think we are going to see some fluctuation here because they're both still top 10 fighters. They've both got very good skill sets, and I believe they've both got a lot to give still as well. So I do think we're going to see fluctuation. At the minute, the current trend is money on Jimmie Rivera, but again, I think that's only going to go so far before we see underdog money coming in on Munhoz. Ultimately, when these fighters step in the cage on Saturday night, I don't think that the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, like I said, it's a really interesting fight. I feel with both Munhoz and Rivera that their ceilings in this division have become very apparent. I don't think they're going to be title challengers. They were both making the way towards a potential title shot, but ultimately falling at the last hurdle. I do think that there's a difference between the top 5 to 10 and the top 3 in the division, and I do think that Rivera and Munhoz will still absolutely win a lot of fights in the UFC, especially at the top of the division, top 5, top 10. I think they've both got a lot to give. It's just I don't think that either of them are good enough to challenge for the title with the fighters that are in front of them in the rankings. So for me, that's definitely something that makes this fight really interesting because they're both still really good fighters. I think this fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think we could see some grappling here. Rivera does have to be careful though. If he does go for a takedown and takes Munhoz down, he's got to be careful not to fall into that guillotine that Munhoz has got. It's a nasty modified guillotine where he ends up locking up the arms, so you can't tap with your arms if you are going out, it's a verbal tap or you tap with your feet. It's a deadly guillotine that Rivera's got to be very careful of. However, the quick counter to that is it does appear to me that Munhoz does have a favoured side for that guillotine, which is his right-hand side. All the guillotines that I've seen him finish have been on that right-hand side. I've seen him try it from the left-hand side and actually try and switch over from the left to the right, which has allowed opponents to escape the guillotine in the middle of that transition from left to right. So that tells me that Munhoz does have a favoured side. If Rivera does shoot a takedown, he has to make sure that it's either a single leg or if it's a double leg, that his head is on that left-hand side of Munhoz. But like I say, regardless of what happens in the wrestling and grappling scenarios, I do think this fight is going to be won and lost on the feet. And even though Munhoz will have moments in this fight, he is a good striker. I do feel like he's going to be a step behind in the striking with Jimmie Rivera. I think Rivera is going to be the slightly quicker fighter, the more technical fighter, the fighter that lands more volume. And if you look at the stats on Munhoz as well, he absorbs more strikes than he lands, which is always a concern as well. So I just think that the striking's going to be close. It's not going to be a whitewash. I don't see Rivera completely running through Munhoz, but I just think when you're looking at the volume and the strikes landed, and also Rivera sits down on punches as well, so he's likely going to have the bigger action strikes. He's also got good low kicks, so if Munhoz's speed does start picking up, because again, Munhoz isn't a slow fighter, he's fast himself, his strikes are fast, but that low kick weapon of Rivera can be a tool used to slow Munhoz down if he does start to become a little bit too much. But ultimately, when I look at this fight from an overview perspective, I do feel like Jimmie Rivera is going to put in the better body of work throughout the fight. I do think he's going to land more strikes. I do think his strikes are going to have more pop on them. I do think things are going to be mixed up better on the feet with Rivera. He's got the wrestling if he needs it as a plan B if it's not going well for him on the feet, although that does come with some dangers which I've already touched upon with the guillotine. But like I say, ultimately I just think Rivera is going to put in the better body of work. I don't think it's going to be a whitewash. I do think it's going to be quite close. Munhoz is definitely going to have moments in this fight, but I do think that Jimmie Rivera is going to get his arm raised, so I'm picking Jimmie Rivera to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the returning Julian Marquez versus Maki Pitolo. Marquez is currently the -170 favourite. The comeback on Pitolo at +150 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Pitolo. Marquez hasn't fought since 2018. He's been out for 2.5 years. He's had a lot of issues. And although Pitolo's been a little flaky at times himself, I do feel that he shouldn't be a +150 underdog in this spot. I'd line this closer to a pick'em. So I do think the value sits with Maki Pitolo. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, the current trend is the money on Pitolo. It's not coming in thick and fast, it is slow and steady, but I do think that current trend continues. I think we see Marquez enter the cage at -145, -150 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how the fight plays out though, it is a really good fight, and if Marquez hadn't have been out for so long, then I do think that I'd favour him to win this fight, but it's really tough. He's had injury problems and, like I say, not being in the cage for 2.5 years, whereas with Pitolo, he wasn't even in the UFC the last time Julian Marquez fought inside the UFC. He's had 6 fights since Julian Marquez last fought, so for me, that's definitely important in this fight. That cage time's really important, especially if Marquez does need one round just to get his feet wet again, so to speak, feel his way into the fight, get his reads, which is quite normal when a fighter's been out for that long. But if he does need that first round and he drops it, then he's definitely going to need rounds 2 and 3 with a 2.5 year layoff. So I do think it's quite a tough fight for Marquez to come back to. I think Pitolo's definitely game, even though, like I've said, he has been a little bit flaky in the past at times. The loss to Callum Potter wasn't great. The way he lost to Darren Stewart wasn't great, but he does look good in regards to his striking, his speed. He's got underrated power in his hands as well. And you can say the same thing for Marquez. Marquez is a good striker. Power, speed. He's got takedowns as well. Pitolo's also got a wrestling background, so from a stylistic perspective, both of these fighters' styles do match up really well because the styles are very similar, so it's going to be really interesting to see who gets the upper hand. For me, I think Pitolo's going to be the faster, more crisper striker, whereas Marquez is probably going to be stronger and more physical. I think that this fight is going to favour the faster, the quicker striker, especially if Pitolo gets off to a fast start. I think Marquez will be playing catch up. He might struggle to be able to catch up and then pull away with the fight because of that layoff. So for those reasons, I'm picking Maki Pitolo to win this fight. In the next fight, the latest addition to the event and fight card, we've got a fight I really like a lot. We've got Bobby Green versus Jim Miller. Bobby Green's currently the -260 favourite. The comeback on Jim Miller at +220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the value absolutely sits with the underdog in Jim Miller. I think the betting line is way too wide, which has been a current theme with Bobby Green lately. He has looked good. He has fought a lot during lockdown, so you can't knock him for it. But yeah, I do think this betting line is a little bit too wide. I think the value sits with Jim Miller. As for where the betting line moves though, even though I do think the value is with Jim Miller, even though I do think the betting line is wide, I do kind of understand why Bobby Green is that big of a favourite as well. So I also feel that other people might think the same way. I think there's going to be fluctuation here. I think Bobby Green might go up to -275, but at that sort of betting line, it's only going to be a matter of time before those Jim Miller bets come in, because I do think that Jim Miller is live here. But like I said, it's a bit of a weird one this, because I kind of get the Bobby Green line at the same time. So I'm really excited for this fight. I do think we're going to see fluctuation on the betting line. Ultimately, on fight night, on Saturday night, I think that the betting lines aren't going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how the fight plays out though, I do think that the cardio and the pace of Jim Miller is a little bit of a concern at the minute. I think that he can start quite fast. His skill set is still there. His jiu-jitsu skills are still world class. So for me, with Jim Miller, he's got to get close to Bobby Green, try and take him down, wear on him on the mat and try and find a submission. But honestly, that is really difficult to achieve when you're fighting Bobby Green. Bobby Green has a wrestling background himself. He's very difficult to take down and is harder to keep down as well. He has very good switches where he'll try and reverse positions, get himself on top. I'm not sure how successful he'll be trying to sweep or reverse or pull off a switch against Jim Miller, but I do feel that Jim Miller's going to have a difficult time having a lot of success on top of Bobby Green, which in my opinion is his best path to victory. I think on the feet, Bobby Green's going to be the quicker striker. I think he's going to land more volume. It's going to be close in the striking exchanges for maybe the first half a round, maybe the first round, but come the second round and the third round, I think Bobby Green is going to start to pull away with this fight. I think he is going to start to land a lot of punches on Jim Miller. I think Jim Miller is going to have to wear these punches, wear this damage, and the longer the fight goes on, the better it should become for Bobby Green. I think Jim Miller's best chance of winning this fight is, like I've said, to try and get the fight down early, get a takedown, get on top of Green, maybe take his back whilst Green is trying to stand up. And if that happens, and that is a possibility, and that's why I do think that Jim Miller is live, if that happens, Jim Miller's got every chance of winning this fight. But if Bobby Green can stretch this fight, take it into deep waters, that's where I think he's really going to start finding his own success on the feet. Ultimately, I feel that Bobby Green will stretch this fight. I think the fight will go long. And as I've mentioned, that just favours Green in my opinion. So I'm picking Bobby Green to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got one of my favourite fighters, Rodolfo Vieira versus Anthony Hernandez. Vieira is currently the -400 favourite. The comeback on Hernandez at +325 is the underdog. As for where the value is on the money line, don't think there's too much value if I'm being honest. I think that the line is absolutely accurate. I think this is a really bad fight for Anthony Hernandez, so I understand why he is a big favourite, but -400 on Vieira is very close to the point where the value just stops, because this is MMA, because there's high variance and it's a volatile sport. So yeah, as for where the value is concerned, I do understand the betting line. I do think that the betting line is absolutely justified. It's very close to that limit. As for where the betting line moves though, I do think more money will come in on Vieira. I think we could potentially see some big money coming in on his money line, so betting him straight, but I also think that he's going to be included in a lot of parlays as well. And I've said this before, that parlay money does count. It does widen betting lines, and between now and fight night on Saturday, I just think that Vieira might be a popular parlay piece. So I do expect Vieira to go to -500, -550, and that's probably where the betting line will close. But as for how this fight plays out, like I've already mentioned, I think it's a really bad stylistic fight for Hernandez. Hernandez can't use his wrestling in this fight. He can't try and take Vieira down, because if he goes down to the mat with Vieira, he's going to get submitted. Vieira is one of the most decorated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts on the planet in mixed martial arts, and there's not very many fighters that will be able to get the better of him down there. So if Hernandez tries taking Vieira down, it's game over. Hernandez has got to also make sure that he doesn't get taken down himself, because again, that will be game over. The thing is with Hernandez, he's got to try and knock Vieira out, but the way Hernandez strikes, especially when he's looking for a finish, is very wild, big hooks, aggression, coming forward, a slight lack of defense. So although he might have an opportunity to catch Vieira and knock him out, that's not beyond the realms of possibility. But if he's coming forward aggressively and swinging, it only takes Vieira just to level change once, or just tie up with him, get a body lock, and use the forward pressure and momentum of Hernandez's body against him to push him against the cage, or to trip him and take him down to the mat. And again, once that happens, it's game over. So unless Hernandez does catch Vieira with a wild strike in a brawl, and he makes this a war and makes Rodolfo Vieira not want to shoot for whatever reason, I do think that Hernandez is going to get taken out of there, and I do think he's going to lose this fight. I don't think that flash KO comes. I do think that there might be some sketchy moments if you're betting on Vieira, but ultimately he'll get the fight where he needs it to be, which is on the mat, and he'll get Hernandez out of there. So I'm picking Rodolfo Vieira to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Dhiego Lima versus Belal Muhammad. Muhammad is currently the -325 favourite. The comeback on Lima at +250 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I don't think there's too much value on the money line, if I'm being honest. I think the line's accurate, I think it's fair, I think it's justified. I do understand why it is so wide with Muhammad at -325, but I don't see too much value. If you are going to push me for a value side, I probably would still say that there's something on Muhammad, potentially in a parlay, but yeah, I think the line's fair. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we are going to see Belal Muhammad enter into a lot of those parlays. And like I've said on this podcast already, and I've said it before, those parlays do widen the betting lines. So I think Belal Muhammad's going to come into this fight on Saturday night roughly around -350, maybe -370. And as for how this fight plays out, I think it's a really difficult fight for Dhiego Lima. Normally at +250 for somebody like Lima, it would look really attractive, but when you actually sit down, you break this fight down and you analyse it, I just really struggle to see a solid path to victory for Dhiego Lima here. He's a good striker himself, but I think Belal Muhammad is more technical on the feet. I think he mixes things up a little better. I think his volume's higher as well. His output will be greater in this fight. So on the feet, I feel that Belal Muhammad will be the better striker. And then when you look at the ground game, Dhiego Lima's got a good ground game, but to get the fight on the mat, your wrestling's got to be solid. I think Lima can potentially score takedowns, but it's not going to be very easy to take Belal Muhammad down. And we haven't really seen Belal Muhammad control too much on the mat either. So I feel like he's one of those fighters that's going to be difficult to take down. You'll expend a lot of energy. And if you do take him down, he's going to be really difficult to keep down as well. So if Lima does take him down, I think Belal Muhammad will get back up to his feet. And then you're back in the striking realm again, where I think he's better. I just feel it's going to be difficult for Lima. For me, Lima's best chance of winning this fight is to potentially score a takedown, maybe hop on the back of Belal Muhammad as he's getting back to his feet, get a body lock, body triangle, and try and hold him there, potentially try and submit him or see the round out, score points. But again, I think it's a low percentage outcome, and I really don't think that Belal Muhammad is going to give this fight up. I think he's going to get his hand raised, so I'm picking Belal Muhammad to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Polyana Vieira versus Mallory Martin. Martin is currently the -155 favourite. The comeback on Vieira at +135 as the underdog. As for where the value is, it feels like the current theme of this episode of the podcast, but I think the betting line's roughly about right. Again, if you are going to push me for a value side, I would probably lean towards the underdog being the value side, but I think they've got the betting lines spot on in this fight. As for where the betting lines move, I can actually see this closing up a little bit. I think people will feel that this is a close fight and it could potentially play out that way, so I think the lines will close up. I don't think it'll go anything close to a pick'em, but if Martin closed as a -125, -130 favourite, it really wouldn't surprise me. As for how this fight plays out, it's really interesting stylistically because both fighters are predominantly grapplers. They'll want to be on the mat. and they'll want to be on the mat in top position. And that's really important in this fight, because I feel whichever fighter is in the top position for longer periods is going to be the fighter that has the more success, is the fighter that's going to be winning rounds. So it's going to be interesting to see which fighter engages in tying up in the clinch and looking to get the fight down to the mat. The thing is, I feel that that fighter is going to be Martin. I think Martin is going to have more urgency in getting the fight down. We saw in a UFC debut against Hannah Cifers, in that first round, Cifers was getting the better of her in the striking. She was really working her to the point where Martin really had to show some urgency to get the fight down to the mat, and in the second round she did, and then it was a whitewash from there. She finished Cifers, she got her out of there, she got her hand raised. The thing is, I feel like Vieira is going to be the better striker in this fight, so even though her game is to normally get the fights down to the mat where she's strongest, to use her jiu-jitsu, I feel that Vieira's best moments in this fight will be on the feet. So if Vieira can keep distance, really work Martin on the feet, then she's got every chance of winning. But I feel like Martin is going to be able to close the distance in the small cage, getting a hold of Vieira, taking her down to the mat, and I think that Martin will have more success on the mat than what Vieira will. I think the fight will be won and lost on the mat, and for that reason I do favour Martin, so I'm picking Mallory Martin to win this fight. And in the next fight, another fight that should have taken place in January, and another fight I'm really glad has been rescheduled. We've got Ricky Simone versus Brian Kelleher. Ricky Simone is currently the -250 favourite to come back on Kelleher at +210 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think there's minimal value on Ricky Simone, but it's really interesting because when these were scheduled back in January, Ricky Simone was -175. Now he's -250. I don't think that that line jump is justified just because he fought Gaetano Perello in the meantime before this fight was rescheduled. So although I do still think that there's some value on that -250 line, I don't necessarily agree with the line difference now compared to what it was back in January. As for where this betting line moves, I actually think that money comes in on Brian Kelleher. I think people are going to be on Kelleher. I think he might be a popular play this week, especially at +210. I think the line's going to close up. I do think it's going to go very close to what it was previously in January, but I don't think it'll close enough that we see that -175 again. I can see Ricky Simone stepping in the cage, -200, -210, come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, I do think it is a good fight for Ricky Simone. Kelleher isn't an easy fighter for anybody to really run through unless you are the cream of the crop at the top of the division, so I don't think it's going to be a complete whitewash by Ricky Simone, but I do think he's going to have some really solid moments in this fight. His relentless wrestling is something that I really like. I feel that if he doesn't like the striking with Kelleher, I think if Kelleher hits him hard and gets his respect early, it'll just turn Ricky Simone into a takedown machine, which he can do for 15 minutes, absolutely no problem. His pace and the pressure that he puts on his opponents, there's not many fighters like it. It's a very Merab Dvalishvili style, which was one of the reasons that when Ricky Simone fought Dvalishvili, it was such an entertaining fight. But there's not many fighters out there that will be able to keep up with that pace and that pressure, let alone match it. I do think Kelleher is going to have problems in that respect in this fight. The problem with beating Ricky Simone is you have to, like I said, match that or keep up with that pace and pressure before you even think about working your own game planning and trying to win the fight yourself. So I think that Kelleher will have moments in this fight. I think he will crack Simone hard a couple of times, which should certainly get the respect of Ricky Simone. But once Simone gets this wrestling game going, becomes relentless, even if he doesn't complete the first takedown, the first entry, he'll push his opponent back to the cage, he'll start to chain wrestle, he'll look for a single leg, he'll go to a double leg. If that doesn't work, he'll look to try and trip you to the mat. If that doesn't work, he'll try and sneak around the back of his opponent. But once he's got his hands and his grip locked behind the back of his opponents, and once he does this to Kelleher, it's going to be really difficult to shake him off, and I think Kelleher's going to have a lot of problems in that area in this fight. I think the takedowns are going to be what wins this fight for Ricky Simone. If this is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, I wouldn't rule Simone out. He's got good striking, it's still developing, but he's going to give Kelleher every chance to win this fight in a 15-minute stand-up fight. And also the betting lines, with how wide it is, definitely won't be reflected if that scenario plays out in the fight. But I don't think it will. At this point, Ricky Simone is really reliable in regards to implementing wrestling into his game plans and into every single fight in the UFC. And I think that's what happens here. I think the wrestling's going to be the difference. I think he's going to score plenty of takedowns. I think Kelleher is going to keep getting back up to his feet because Ricky Simone doesn't have that heavy top pressure jiu-jitsu which can keep his opponents on their back. I do think Kelleher will be able to stand up. Simone does have to be careful that he doesn't shoot lazy takedowns though, because the guillotine of Kelleher is a dangerous weapon, and if he does wrap up that guillotine, he's got every chance of finishing and submitting Ricky Simone. But Ricky Simone, his wrestling style is really solid. He does tend to try and lift his opponent on a double leg and land outside of the full guard, which is where obviously the guillotine is completed. And if he doesn't look for the double leg, he'll look to a single leg and land in half guard or side control. So he always looks to try and land outside of the guard, and that's really key here. I think Ricky Simone's just going to be too much for Kelleher. I think the takedowns are going to come in the numbers. I think it's really going to make Kelleher hesitant striking come the second round, halfway through the second round. And the longer this fight goes on, it should get easier for Simone. So I'm picking Ricky Simone to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gabe Green versus Phil Rowe. Green is currently the -120 favourite. The comeback on Rowe at +100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Phil Rowe. After analysing each fighter, I do understand why the betting lines are close, but in my opinion, it probably should be flipped the other way, with Phil Rowe being the -120 favourite and Green being the +100 underdog. So for that reason, I do think the value sits with Phil Rowe. As for where this betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we're going to see some fluctuation here. I think +100 for Phil Rowe. I think there'll be people on that. It might push this fight to a pick'em. Then there'll probably be money coming back in on Gabe Green, who's the more experienced fighter, very explosive. So I think there's going to be some fluctuation, and it wouldn't surprise me if both fighters entered the cage on Saturday night with this as a -110 pick'em on either side. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really interesting fight because I feel that Phil Rowe has got so much more to give. I think that the room for development is really great. I think he's a little green right now, but he's going to be one of those fighters that is improving from fight to fight. His athleticism looks completely on point. He looks like he's working hard in the gym. So honestly, I do expect to see Rowe developing from fight to fight, and this is actually a good fight for him to come into because I don't think that he's fighting somebody with too much experience. I don't think he's in a fight where it's just too much too soon for him, and I do think that he's going to have a lot of good moments in this fight. He has definitely got to be careful of the explosiveness of Gabe Green, because Green will come in a little reckless, but he'll swing bombs. He can eat a punch as well. Daniel Rodriguez hit him with some really hard shots that Green just ate most of them with no problem whatsoever, just to come forward and just to land back himself. So Phil Rowe has got to try and keep his distance, try and control that range in this fight. It's going to be difficult at times, and that's why the betting lines are close, because Green will be able to close the distance in this fight at times. It's just how Phil Rowe deals with that. I think Green's a little reckless though, and he's a little hittable coming in with his hands down, especially the longer the fight goes on. He hasn't got a gas tank issue, but he does look to slow down a little bit, and when he slows down, his hands tend to come down a little bit as well. I think Phil Rowe will be able to blast him as he's coming in. But the one thing that I do like about Gabe Green is he's got a really good double jab. He's got really good fundamentals, so he does have the skills, the skill set, and the ability to close the distance really effectively, whilst also being defensively responsible. But he chooses to be wild, and he looks to be fun and exciting and come forward, and that's great for us to watch as fans. But I think that Phil Rowe's going to have opportunities in this fight to find a hole down the middle where he can fire a hard strike, really start pushing Green back, and once Green's on the back foot, that's where Rowe does really look to do his best work, when he's moving forward, when he's being aggressive, picking his shots to the body and the head. So although I do think that Rowe is still very green himself, I do think he's going to be developing from fight to fight. I don't think this is a bad stylistic matchup for him. I'm picking Phil Rowe to win this fight. And in the next fight, and in the final breakdown of this episode, we've got Julian Robertson versus Miranda Maverick. Maverick is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Robertson at +120 is the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Julian Robertson. I think she's more experienced. I think she's fought the better level of competition, and I think she's got a solid path to victory. Now, when I first saw the betting lines released, I did think this was absolutely crazy and potentially one of the worst betting lines I'd ever seen, but the more I did dig into the fight and analyse both fighters, the more I did see an angle on Maverick, but I still believe that there's value on Julian Robertson, and this fight should be a pick'em at the absolute minimum. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think we are going to see more people jumping in on Julian Robertson. I think we are going to see that pick'em line, and come fight night on Saturday night, it wouldn't shock me at all if we saw Julian Robertson a very slight favourite in this fight, maybe -115, -120, but I certainly think we're going to see it at around a pick'em in a couple of days' time. As for how this fight plays out though, I did mention that I saw things that made me see an angle of why Maverick is a favourite, and one of those things in particular was the strength and the physicality of Maverick. And the style of Julian Robertson is based on closing the distance, getting her opponent down to the mat, and we've seen Robertson struggle in fights against fighters that are very difficult to take down because they are much bigger and stronger than Robertson. And this fight really does fit that bill because Maverick is big, she is strong, she is physical, and I do think that that's going to present some problems for Robertson. I think she's going to have some difficulties trying to bully her, trying to drag her down to the mat. Maverick's got good takedown defense as well. So I don't think that this fight is very simple and straightforward for Robertson. But the bottom line is, at some point, I do think she is going to be able to get this fight to the mat. And when she does, Maverick isn't a rookie on the mat. Robertson isn't going to slice through her like butter. But I do think Robertson is definitely the better grappler. I think she's going to be able to get her jiu-jitsu going, flow on top, potentially block transitions, reversals, escape opportunities, and potentially look for mistakes from Maverick on the bottom to set up submission opportunities, maybe even take a back, maybe even look for a choke. It just all depends on how quickly Robertson can get Maverick down to the mat. On the feet, Maverick's the better striker. She's going to be the more imposing, she's going to be the more aggressive. I think Robertson's going to be in some spots where she's getting hit a little bit too much. The takedowns might start looking a little bit desperate, but as I've already mentioned, I think the experience is going to be a factor in this fight as well. Julian Robertson has been in there with some really good fighters and she's beaten some top fighters as well. So I do think that she is going to face adversity in this fight, but I think she'll also have a lot of success as well. I think she'll get the takedowns that she needs. If she doesn't submit Maverick, then I think she'll be able to have enough top time in order to win rounds on the judges' scorecards. So I'm picking Julian Robertson to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which is free by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. Just hop on to MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.